Café Oc is the name of the travel memoir that I'm going to talk about today. And it is close to being published. It's, my literary agent presently is presenting it to publishers with the sequel, Café Neanderthal, which is a popular book on Neanderthals and the archaeologists who excavate them and the locals in this part of southwestern France who are incredibly aware of their prehistory. I mean, they're farmers and winemakers and shopkeepers, and they all know about Neanderthals and Cro-Magnon. And I'm going to talk about Cro-Magnon, Cro-Magnon, or how, we hear many pronunciations, but that's the popular word for early modern humans, basically us. But it's a trekking time traveler's tales in the France of truffles, troubadours, and Cro-Magnon. The alliteration I apologize for, but I kind of liked it. But it does capture the spirit of this region, of the Dordogne in southwestern France. And I have a map coming up to really show you where it is that I have been doing my research and writing of late. But I love this sculpture is in front of the sports club in Sarlat. And this tells you a lot about how locals feel about their prehistory. This is, when you go to play badminton or basketball, you pass by this wonderful sculpture of human evolution. So this is a cognitive map and a physical map of where I have done research as both an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, and as a writer. And all the circles are kind of the areas, contain the areas that I was looking at together. I'm really deeply interested in those areas where different cultures interact with each other, whether it's at what we now call modern national borders, or more ancient areas where cultures crossed over and really cross-pollinated each other, such as northern Morocco and southern Spain, or Portugal and Spain. Especially, you see a lot of interesting cultural expressions in northern Portugal and northwestern Spain. And the Camino, the pilgrimage road to Santiago de Compostela, is a part of that fascination. I talked about that last night. But I'm really, really obsessed right now about that green area, the darker green area, the Pyrenees, and what's going on between French and Spanish culture. And it's busting out our ideas, actually, of these modern cultures, because there's so much nuance going on the ground. And I think that's true anywhere. If we were to look at our backyard with the same sort of removing the obvious categories and labels that we've been living with, we would find there's incredible nuance in our own backyard. And this is kind of like, for a cultural anthropologist to be working in France and Spain, everyone's going, oh, why aren't you going to Africa? Why aren't you going to East Asia? And, well, I think the world is immensely interesting everywhere. And I kind of like going to a part of the world where everyone thinks they know it, and then coming back and saying, but wait, let's lift the lid on this, and let's look at these nuances. And I've surprised people in France about what I've found out. They just go, really? People still speak Occitan, for example? So, why Oc? Why Café Oc? Oc is the word for yes in Occitan. And Occitan is the language that we would probably most likely have heard about it through the troubadours, especially at the peak of their poetry and their music in the 12th century. Occitan and its very closely related cousins, maybe more accurately siblings, were many Romance languages that were spoken in the regions throughout northern Italy, even into Switzerland, southern France, and into northern Spain and Portugal. And today they're still spoken. They just didn't win out official recognition the way Spanish and French did. So, but here, so there's Paris, right? And where I do a lot of my work is right here in Sarlat, La Canéda. You've got Toulouse there, Bordeaux there. The Dordogne or Périgord area is kind of like in this general vicinity. And this is getting a little closer. So you can see the Pyrenees are the great border here. And because you have an entire border of mountains, you also, that deepens the nuance of the cultures that are there because there's greater isolation and solidification of those very particular regional and local identities and languages. There's many, many dialects of Occitan. So the blue is kind of outlining the areas in the world today that speak a variation of Occitan. You will have Provençal in the area of Provence. We've got some Occitan-related speaking in these areas of Switzerland and Italy. Then there are dialects throughout. There's Languedoc, which is really the language of Oc, so it's really giving you a full hint that this is Occitan territory. And Sarlat-la-Canéda is a part of the dialect of the Languedoc. But then you also have Gascogne, and then you really get interesting things when Basque starts mixing with Occitan. And you get a kind of Basque and Occitan mix in these areas. Then, of course, maybe most people have heard of Catalan. Catalan is the closest to the Occitan that's spoken in southern France. But then you've got Aragonese, you've got Navarrese, you've got Asturiano, you've got Gallego, and then Portuguese is very close too. And I have friends in Catalonia who say they understand Occitan and Portuguese perfectly. But Café Oc, the name of my travel memoir, actually comes from a group of very funny and feisty and gregarious people in Sarlat who once a month meet at a cafe, and they call themselves Café Oc, and they just say, come and practice speaking Occitan. Everyone is welcome, and it's also implied that, come at your own risk because we're very funny and we might, you don't know what we're going to say to you. So one night in winter, I did go and visit the Café Oc group just to see if an Iranian-American anthropologist like myself had a place there, and if they would just think it was too weird that I wanted to also learn Occitan, because these were all people who, the youngest person in the group was 65, and the oldest person was almost 90, and they wanted to practice a language now that is being less and less used, especially when you leave the countryside or even going into the smaller towns. So I went one night, and it meets at the Le Verrou Café. And the Le Verrou is, has anyone heard of the Le Verrou? This is already a nice sort of cave entrance opening into living folklore in this region. The Le Verrou, I don't know if you can make out from the slide the image of the man who's walking like this, and he's wearing the pelt of a wolf that has the head of a rabbit. And when I first heard of the Le Verrou, I was asking locals, what's a Le Verrou? And they'd say, well, first of all, don't think it's a werewolf. And because a lot of people have associated it with the werewolf, because the Le Verrou shows up on a full moon night, and he changes. When that full moon comes out, he changes. So that, it's a lot like the werewolf. But then it starts it goes into entirely unfamiliar territory from any of the folklore I've ever heard. It's more a person of the nature of a bit of a wild nature, and the full moon brings it out. They can no longer control themselves. And the only way that they can break the spell, and I've been fitting together different versions of this character, because even locals kind of go, well, this is what I heard my grandfather say, or this is what I heard my great aunt say. And apparently the person who has this predicament of being the Le Verrou kind of doesn't really want it either, but they have a bit of that wild nature, so the full moon comes out and they can't help themselves. They go running into the forest and they start wreaking havoc. And they have to get to 7 churches or chapels before the sun rises to break the spell. And if they can't, then the next full moon, they're going to just keep doing this. And so a lot of trickster kind of things are attributed to the Le Verrou. And you don't want to be walking through a forest on a full moon, because he is so intent on rushing through the forest and getting to the next church and the next church, and he gets so tired that people say that if you're in the forest that night, he is going to just jump on your back and say, carry me to the next church so I can rest. And then you won't be able to shake this guy off. And some people say he actually transforms into this hybrid animal of this sort of wolf-rabbit creature. Others say, no, he just wears the hide of this hybrid creature. So this is the cafe where we're practicing Occitan. And I fell in love with this group. They immediately welcomed me in, and they kind of liked the weirdness of this person who didn't grow up in the culture, wanting to learn the language. And for me, it was a boon because Occitan, I was really starting to dive deeply into French, and I had come to French from Spanish, and I had come to France through Spain. And Occitan, actually, I still can't speak it, but I understand it because it's closer to Spanish, and it's also very close to French. So it was fun for me, and they filled me in on stories of their childhood and how to outsmart your neighbor when it's porcini hunting season. You know, as they call it sep, the wild mushrooms start coming up in the forest, and everyone is mushroom crazy. And I'm mushroom crazy. I see smiles on your faces. I think there's some mushroom crazy people here. And they just had all these really funny ways of outsmarting their neighbor. And they're like, you get up really early in the morning, and you take a basket and you cover it with a cloth. Not because you're going to protect your mushrooms. You just don't want your neighbors to know how much you've got in there or if you have anything in there. And then you find your place in the forest and you get down on your belly and you scuttle in and you leave no evidence and you just stay low and you gather all your mushrooms. And then before the sun rises, you put that cloth over the mushrooms and you pretend like you've just come back from market. So Sarlat. This is the town of Sarlat. It's a town that was probably occupied since Celtic Roman times. And then it was resettled by a group of monks in the 9th century after their monastery was completely destroyed by a Viking raid on the Dordogne River. And they said, living on the Dordogne River is a little risky right now, so let's go a little further north from the river and resettle at this old Gallo-Roman site. These are just some scenes from Sarlat and the surrounding area. One of the things that really drew me to this particular area of France is I always knew, because of what I was learning in northern Spain, that it was going to be really important to go into southern France because there were so many things of the cultures that informed each other and said something about the bigger picture. And they really have a lot in common. And that's the part of suspending my ideas of what is France and what is Spain, because there is this sort of southern French, northern Spanish culture that has more in common with its neighbor than with the further north or further south in France or Spain. But I also wanted to go to a place, because I love going to places that have a continuous connection with their past. And I love to go to places where that past is really, really deep. And this part of Europe has the highest concentration of prehistoric sites. A lot of really high concentration of Neanderthal sites, really high concentration of early modern human sites, really high concentration of when painted caves and engraved caves start appearing, anywhere from 36,000 years ago to about 12,000 years ago. And today, it is still an area in France and in Europe that never was industrialized. So that right there is a good indication that probably people there feel a deep connection to the land. And what I found blew me away. It was even more profound than that. People are very, very aware of the time depth of their land. I spoke to so many farmers who, without me prompting it or giving a leading question, would just tell me, when I plow my land, I'm thinking about Neanderthals, I'm thinking about Cro-Magnon or early modern humans, I'm thinking about the Bronze Age people who, put up the dolmens, there's a dolmen down the street, and That, to me, I wanted to learn what that was like. So it's a place that lives by the seasons, where you go to the market and you know what the seasonal foods are, and you eat seasonally. I wanted to explore the strata. While going through the seasons kind of this way, I wanted to explore the strata and go from the present all the way down to the Neanderthal level, and passing through the very interesting Middle Ages as well. And I wanted to explore the magic of what it's like to live in a place like this now. So these are some scenes of Sarlat. You may very well have been to Sarlat yourself and not know it, because Sarlat has appeared in many, many historical films. The medieval heart center of the town is so what's the right word? It was not renovated, restored in the 1960s to the present, that a lot of historical films are shot here. If you saw The Musketeer, you've certainly been to Sarlat. I think parts of the Michael Crichton's timeline flashed through Sarlat, and certainly the region. And I thought for a JCCC, this is a really nice contribution to an actor taking a break, and he pulled his cell phone out of his leather trousers. But I arrived there at the slowest tourist period in the Dordogne. It was late January, maybe the third week of January, and what I arrived to was a very vibrant local market. It allowed me immediately to start exploring what was being grown on the land and what was seasonal for winter. And half the merchants that I spoke to were speaking first Occitan. And then when they realized I couldn't respond in Occitan, then they would shift to French. So that also kind of went, oh, this is really interesting. And the strata, so markets are always reminding you of seasons, but there are other things that are reminding you also of the time depth and the strata. This is the National Museum of Prehistory with its iconic sculpture to early man up on the top there. And it's built in an old rock shelf. And below it is one of the best cafes to go to get a cup of coffee or a cold beer. So you've got the past and the present right on top of each other. I also enjoyed exploring the medieval expressions in the church in Sarlat. The Saint-Sacerdo Cathedral has beautiful engravings that are just kind of hidden, and they look exactly like people look today if you go and you talk to the farmers and the winemakers with those magnificent mustaches, such as this guy. You meet very interesting locals, such as a man who herds geese. I was astounded by this man. All he did was make sounds with his mouth, very subtle sounds, and carry a staff. And look at the geese. They were just in formation. Other wonderful locals. This is my friend at the cathedral. I call him Mr. Stripes. Herds of donkeys. Have you ever seen herds of donkeys? This is, for me, a first. And clusters of black, looking for clusters of black. This is the black truffle of the Périgord. And these people here, I thought there was a drug deal going down because it really looked illicit. And people were getting on their cell phones, and the guy just cranked open the back of his van. But it was happening right in front of the mayor's office, the town hall. And there were police surrounding it. So at first it looks like a drug bust, but what it is a truffle hunter was bringing in his baskets of truffles for the Wednesday market. And the Wednesday market, there's 2 truffle markets in winter in Sarlat. The Wednesday market is the really superior grade, the ones that are getting, say, maybe even up to $1,400 per kilo. And this is what the black truffle looks like. And I can't explain. It's a very irrational thing. It looks like a dog turd, right? And it has the most intoxicating smell. And it's a bit of an illicit smell too. It makes you think of stolen kisses in dark alleys. It's a crazy crazy fungus. It grows it's in a symbiotic relationship with certain trees around their roots. You never know if it's going to grow or not. People have been trying to cultivate it with mixed results. But winter is truffle season. And one of the best ways to enjoy a truffle is sliced on a good piece of fresh bread with butter, a little bit of sea salt. And if you have a glass of champagne, don't you? So one of the methods of research that I use in addition to the classic ethnographic method, anthropological method, which is participant observation. You go to a place, you really immerse yourself, you participate, you observe, you learn the language, is also walking, doing a lot of walking, especially in a territory like this where there's so much connection to the land. And so much of what's going on is not in the towns. It's actually on the land and in the countryside. So I spent a lot of time walking and walking into the forests. And this gives you an idea of why there are so many occupied caves, because there are these limestone formations all over the place, such as this one. And then I would stop and talk to farmers when they were out, and I wasn't bothering them. And I learned about what they were growing. They almost always spoke Occitan. And a lot of them would just keep speaking Occitan. I don't know if word got out that there's this weird Iranian-American anthropologist about, and she understands Occitan, but she can't speak it. But I learned so much from them about the land and the lore of the place. It's an area well known for its walnuts, too, and its strawberries, and its mushrooms. And there's a cep, there's a porcini. I learned how to mushroom hunt with the locals, and I learned which mushrooms definitely not to pick. Don't eat those. Blackberries, this is the fruits of summer. And the market changes its color, it changes its dress as the seasons move through, and that's just splendid. So this is my home base. I have a good friend who has a studio apartment right in the center of the medieval town. And it was a perfect perch because this is my window, and my window looks out on one of the two market squares in town. So even before getting dressed and going down to participate in the market, I could see what was going on from my it's almost like those wildlife shows where you're behind the screen and you get to observe. And the person right below my window was either selling apples or a variety of herbs, depending on the season. The fish seller here would arrive at 5:30 in the morning, and that was when I knew that I couldn't sleep anymore because she'd get all her ice out and she'd start shoveling it. But then I would peek out and see what the fresh fish was for that particular market day, and make a plan for fish that day for lunch. The bread baker was also setting up below my window. I got to see what he was having for breakfast, and I was interested as I went through the seasons in Sarlat, how the thermos of coffee was then replaced with a bottle of red wine, and they were enjoying cheese and bread and sausages for breakfast. And the market's tough, it's really hard work. And then there was the woman who sold cheese and her dog who would put on a show when he was tired of sleeping in his little dog tent. One of the slips deeper into the strata for me in Sarlat was when one day I went to buy olives, and the husband and wife who sell olives in the market took an interest in me, and they said, would you like to come and have lunch with us? And we live in a really lovely old stone farmhouse, and it's not far from here, and we promise we'll bring you home and you'll be fine. They knew it was like we're complete strangers, but would you like to come and have lunch with us? So they invited me to their 15th century stone farmhouse. And this is their cat, Ferdinand, who has their walk-in fireplaces right behind his head. And that's a leg of lamb hanging from a string with some lemon strung onto the string. And it's just twirling around and being roasted by the fire. This is what they called a casual lunch that they were bringing a stranger home to. And of course, Ferdinand was very interested in that leg of lamb. I also spent a lot of time exploring the sacred sites the local sacred sites that the locals were telling me were sacred, not the ones that may be found in the Michelin Green Guide or other guidebooks. And one was the Church of Temniac. This is the crypt. And it's a place where there have been many healings during times of plague. And people from Sarlat will make the pilgrimage up to the top of the hill in Temniac, which is just about 1.5 miles away. And it is a magical place. It has this beautiful inlaid mosaic of the 6-petaled flower, the seed of life, which I was intrigued by as well. More of the Liberu. I also explored the rock shelves that were occupied since prehistory, but then in the Middle Ages were places where people would build their entire towns to protect themselves from raids on the river. This one is on the Vézère River, the Dordogne. This part of the Dordogne has 2 major rivers, the Vézère and the Dordogne, and they kind of, like a triangle, frame in the region. And they also hold the highest concentration of prehistoric sites. This particular rock shelf was occupied in the Middle Ages, and it's looking over the Vézère River. You can kind of see a bridge right over there. Am I getting it right? And on the other side is Le Moustier. I don't know if you've heard of Mousterian tools, but the cave of Le Moustier is the Neanderthal site that gave the whole Neanderthal tool tradition its name, Mousterian. So that, those are your neighbors in different time periods, of course. And I enjoyed exploring the medieval world here. This is along the Dordogne. This is La Roque-Gageac. I also enjoyed the seasonal traditions, the local traditions. This is for a wedding. And I don't know if it exists in other parts of France. It probably could, but people they make these beautiful crepe flowers, and they tie them to trees all over the place where they want to seek blessings and grace for their marriage. And this was outside a small church. But sometimes I saw it around this chapel. This is an old spring that probably was recognized as a holy spring during the Celtic Iron Age period in the Dordogne. And now there's a shepherd's hut built right over the spring, and people have been receiving miracle cures, and now they attribute those miracle cures to Mary, and they give it a very Christian attire. But it's more ancient than that, and you find out that it is because what they do at this shrine is not anything that you would say is a part of the Christian or the Catholic tradition. This is a sculpture of Mary, and for one thing, she doesn't look like our normal depictions of Mary. And even one local said, "Well, she's the pagan Mary," And a lot of people just feel like they can connect and identify with her more. But this particular stream and shrine is for people who are trying to kick addictions, whether they are substance abuse or they're more psychological or behavioral addictions. They come here and they have a whole series of rituals that they perform here, and they ask the place to pull it out of them. So that was another surprise to find this kind of a tradition in play. I also learned the tradition of le chabrol. It's where when you finish your good winter soup, like a good pumpkin soup, you throw a healthy dollop, that's a healthy dollop of red wine into the bowl, and you swish it around and you drink it. And I thought I was about to be rude because the soup was so good by taking a piece of bread, and I really just wanted to wipe the bowl with it. And one of my neighbors, this is a communal feast that I was invited to in the forest, because these things do happen. And he said, "Oh my God, that's heresy." And I'm thinking, yeah, I've been called out. That was rude. He said, no, there's a much better way. And he threw some red wine in my bowl. And it used to be a man's tradition, because in the folklore of the Dordogne, women who did it would risk growing a beard. And I'm here to tell you, so far so good. And then going into the strata, going really, really deeper into the strata. This is a reconstruction of Homo erectus in the National Prehistory Museum in Les Aisies, right along the Vézère River in the Dordogne. And I just love the fact that my friend Marie gave me a photo op when she stepped right in frame. as I was taking a picture of the reconstruction of Homo erectus, because their hairdos are smashingly similar. And then moving more forward in time, I spent a lot of time in the early modern sites, such as Lascaux, the reproduction of Lascaux. Lascaux now is completely closed to protect it. But this is a bird who lives in Lascaux, and it's a magical place, and the bird even announces it. I mean, he really came this close to me. It's a rouge-gorge. It's a red-throated, it's called the European robin. It might be more related to a thrush, but I'm not entirely sure of its designation. But I really started exploring the strata, and I started going into the prehistory with the locals. This is the Font de Gomme, which is, I'm going to read a little bit of my memoir in a couple minutes, and I'll talk more about this particular site. It has the keeper as well. Like Lascaux has the bird, the Font de Gomme has this cat. And even Cro-Magnon, the Abri Cro-Magnon, is the original rock shelf where the early modern human skeletons were found that were called Cro-Magnon. This is where we get it from. And I've read in a lot of books, well, you know, Cro-Magnon just must mean like the great this or the great that. It's from Latin, and they deconstruct it. And I went here with a local, and he said, oh, no, Cro is le creux. It's just hole in Occitan. And Magnon is, Monsieur Magnon, that's his house right next door to the site where they found his skeleton. So it's old Monsieur Magnon's hole. That's what Cro-Magnon is. The local knowledge is great. That's where it was found. There were 5 skeletons were found there, about 27,000 years old. This is a legendary local, Monsieur Pémentron. He is a farmer, and he lives on land that they discovered 2 prehistoric caves that had beautiful engravings in them that dated to, I think, anywhere from 13,000 years ago to 18,000 years ago. And you can call him and arrange a time to visit, and he'll show up just like this. His pointer is a twig that he's fashioned, and it's in the back of his pants as he walks. And when he walks, it goes. And in that shoulder bag is a car battery and a car headlight that he's fashioned as a way to illuminate the caves when you go into them. And this is one example of the cave, and one engraving that I was allowed to take a photograph of. Like, can you see the head of the horse? And then the most serendipitous thing happened in the Sarlat market. A lot happens in the market. This is where a lot of people's social bonds are forged and reinforced. One day I was shopping for shallots, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw this man in the tan shirt whisk by. And I immediately knew I had seen this figure before. It turned out to be, he was my archaeology professor in graduate school, maybe 20 years back, and I think it might be more than that. And then he was gone. He was like, and I'm sure it had to have been an apparition. Well, I sent him an email, and an hour later he wrote back and he said, what the heck are you doing in Sarlat? And I said, well, what are you doing here? I'm here studying the life here and working on writing a travel narrative, a travel memoir. He said, well, I'm here to open up the Neanderthal site we're working on. Why don't you come and have dinner and we'll talk about it? And I wound up doing that. And I wound up writing a feature story on him and his work. And so these are some of the classic Neanderthal sites. That one was Roque de Marsal. This is Pêche de Laz. And this is La Ferracie, which is where we're now working. And this particular site was occupied by Neanderthals 70,000 to 50,000 years ago. And then it was occupied by early modern humans after that, from about 37,000 years ago, right up to the present, because there's also a medieval layer, and you see some iron ore that they were doing some kind of smelting in the upper cave. And then teenagers were using it before it was blocked off for, going and, having some privacy in the cave. And we found there archaeological evidence for that as well. So let's hang out on this rock shelf. And if I may, I'd like to read a little bit of what I've written in the memoir. The first one comes from my first winter in Sarlat. A young American woman stumbled out of the cave and took a big gulp of air. I was right behind her and was afraid she was fainting, maybe from claustrophobia. The Font de Gaume cave wasn't as tight as others, but it still had narrow passages that made you feel like you were passing through the Earth's birth canal. Her mothers rushed past me, hip women from San Francisco in form-fitted black leather jackets and fashionably faded blue jeans. Like lionesses defending their young, they ushered their only daughter to a rock and grabbed a bottle of water. They were visiting France in winter, while their daughter spent a year teaching English in Bordeaux. Today, they were sightseeing together throughout the Dordogne. Our guide, a Cat Stevens look-alike with long salt and pepper hair and a black cable turtleneck sweater and cave-worn jeans, rushed to assist. We were all worried. For someone so hale and hearty, she looked deathly pale. The young woman shook her head and took another deep breath. I'm fine, I'm fine. She looked at her worried mothers. It's just that I'm overwhelmed by so much time. She glanced up apprehensively at me, the only other person on this little tour and a stranger, but she relaxed when she saw me smiling. I thought I understood what she was feeling. Life seemed normal up until now. Then she had come face to face with something 17,000 years ago, and life no longer was normal in any reasonable way. Her Homo sapiens brain had to adjust. The Font de Gaume was narrow throughout. When we encountered an engraving or polychrome painting, its impact was immediate and intimate. At one point, we halted at a handprint found underneath a stone ledge at knee height. Our guide said it was the left hand of a woman. Given our audience, we were excited, but also skeptical. Hadn't cave art specialists of the past insisted these were masculine spaces? Experts are certain it was a woman's hand, he explained. Our earlier ideas of prehistoric artists or shamans as being men is off. I liked him. As we moved on, we were treated to engraved and painted animals. The Font de Gaume is one of the very rare prehistoric caves with polychrome paintings that is still open to the public. The guide took us reverently into this world, explaining that all the animals found in the Font de Gaume, his old friends by now, were in a state of peace. There was no image of hunting or killing. This has some thinking that it was a place of great power, where the animals depicted were revered. He reinforced this idea by stating that no plants, no trees, no humans, except for hands, are depicted here. Just large animals, mostly bison, but also horses, a mammoth, some rhinoceroses, and reindeer, though the deer are the least depicted of the big animals. And while this is so, the most emotionally moving image in the entire cave is the one of the two deer, the frise des rennes, where one bows before the other who licks its nose. The tongue is clearly there, engraved, gently licking the face of the other. It feels like a 17,000-year-old expression of love and affection reaching out from the walls to touch our hearts again. It might have been this vision that began to unravel our young companion's sense of belonging on Earth. My first prehistoric cave experience had been a couple years earlier. South of Santander, in northern Spain's Cantabrian region, at the Cave of El Castillo, outside of Puente Viejo. The cave had evidence of human presence from up to 150,000 years ago, and also of some of the first human art dating to some 40,000 years ago. It was overwhelming to stand a few feet from such antiquity and to realize someone 40,000 years ago had stood there where I stood, but had a completely different life. My first glimpse of the old pigment-outlined handprints created an odd out-of-body feeling, like someone was standing next to me. The elegant elk and bison worked three-dimensionally onto cave walls chosen for their contours as much as for their unknowable cave feng shui was like being pushed into a higher threshold of mystical experience. Something in my brain got it, something that has been around all the while, replicated generation after generation in our DNA, but I lacked the words to state it or the experience to explain it. My head swam and I was no longer able to gauge my own tiny lifespan. I also I was also tackled head-on by an awe that filled the breathable spaces of that cavern of ancient human ancestry. I was overwhelmed by time. The rest of that day had existed in a dreamy, time-suspended state. I had a glass of wine in the village cafe nearby. I had already entered an altered state of mind. I thought the wine would relax me, but paradoxically I had already relaxed beyond the point of relaxation and was easing back into just how small I was. Rather than causing anguish, such awareness made me let go of a lot of contemporary what life ought to look like baggage. Suddenly I was simply there, fully in the present, breathing and savoring the journey. I had visited that cave with two friends. One of them had disappeared from the cafe where we silently sipped our wine. Her bag was still on her chair, her wine untouched. Worried, I finally got up to find her and found her standing at the back of our rental car, the back hatch up. She'd broken open her watercolors and was sketching and painting the images we'd just seen in the cave. She had a dreamy expression on her face, a time traveler's expression. When she saw me approach, she simply said, "I needed to ground myself after that. I was overwhelmed by how old and how fresh our ancestors' images were." I said nothing. There was nothing to add to that. I looked at her painting. Over and over, she had painted in black and ochre the outlined images of so many hands, 40,000-year-old hands, pressing through the stone to meet us from the other side of the veil. So that's a taste of going into these really old places in the Dordogne, and there's so many of them. Moving, into another season, the first autumn that I spent in the Dordogne and in Sarlat as my home base, I was coming back one day I was trying to find Temniac, the church that had the miracle cures during times of plague, and it was a strange experience because no matter how much I used a topographical map and compass, or went to Google Earth and located it, every time I actually got out on the road to find it, it was like Shambhala. It just wasn't going to show itself to me. It was just going to, it only shows itself to certain people, apparently. And so finally, one day I decided I'm going to find this church, and I'm going to leave the map and the compass at home because apparently these are decoys. And I'm just going to ask locals. And sure enough, by asking locals, I found the church. And I was rushing back. The sun was setting, and this was in the fall, rushing back from finding this church. And that's where I'll pick up from for my second vignette that I'd like to share with you. I arrived back in the heart of Sarlat as the last drops of light dissipated into the darkening blue night sky. L'heure bleue, my favorite time of day, especially in Sarlat when the setting sun leaves a deep cobalt blue behind, complementing the golden stone and the evening lights, and when the evening lights begin to flash on. I loved how everyone was finished with work, but buying their evening bread. Some doing some window shopping and some meeting friends for a glass. I loved it especially now, this week, the third week in November, when the year's new wines were released all across France. It usually came in the form of Beaujolais Nouveau, and these new bottles appeared overnight, arrayed at the entranceways to wine shops and grocery stores, whispering in excitement, only found in autumn. The sun is setting earlier, the air has a slight chill, but early evening is still electric to be out in with friends. It's the perfect time to gather in a local cafe and try the year's new red. I recalled a Parisian friend saying once, "The new wine is how we learn what this particular year tastes like. It's a review of the year, wrapping things up in a flavor that succinctly defines it." He then confessed that he wasn't a fan of years that tasted too banana-like, a risk of the young Beaujolais. I wanted to taste this year, the year of my first spring, summer, and autumn in Sarlat. I wanted to note it well, reflect, and remember forever its taste in one sip of wine, the flavor of the year that changed everything. I too hoped it was less ripe banana and more forever. I rushed to Le Chardon, which is the name of the studio my friend has, the Thistle. Splashed some water on my face and changed my clothes and shoes. I then asked my neighbor from Liverpool, Simpson, who was renting the apartment across the hall, and Nadia, my landlady, and Cedric, a good friend of ours, after their evening badminton practice to join me at Le Bataclan, a locals bar in the heart of town, to taste the magical year together. The first round would be on me, they agreed. Deep into the blue hour we arrived. As I pulled the door open, I could see that the bar pulsed with the energy of a group gathering to watch a heated rugby match. But tonight, the overhead TV monitors were off, yet the crowd was even more pumped up. Excited to find out what was all the buzz, I pushed through the door. In that moment, my face rammed into the high-velocity backhanded fist of a burly man at the bar. Crack! My head flew back. Simpson caught me. I saw birds and stars everywhere. This wasn't my idea of a first round, but it was definitely on me. I don't recall much of those initial seconds, except that I didn't think my nose was broken, and that I felt Simpson step forward and angrily demand an explanation. What sort of a man hits a woman? I think I heard him say. As noted, he was from Liverpool, and I could feel his fists warming up for a fight. As the stars and birds cleared from my vision, the man hurriedly apologized, and his two buddies quickly stepped between their friend and Simpson and explained that it had been an accident, that their friend was too deep into his cups, intoxicated over the new wine, the Gaillac Primeur, and was animatedly expressing his love for it with arms swinging hard and wide and backwards when I walked into the line of jubilant fire. As my head cleared, it made sense. I also was relieved to confirm that my nose wasn't broken and the punch hadn't drawn blood, but I was going to have a swollen snout and maybe black circles under my eyes for the next couple of days. So, the Gaillac I managed through throbbing sinuses is that much better than the Beaujolais? The whole bar went silent and looked at me in astonishment. The bartender broke the stillness by explaining that, while he'd be happy to find a bottle of Beaujolais Nouveau for me, if that was really what I wanted, that yes, truly, the young Gaillac was superior, worth flailing arms and gesticulating fists. How? I asked, finding that talking about wine diminished my pain. For such a young wine, the bartender began, it has less of that thick fruit taste, the banana that often dominates a Beaujolais Nouveau. And more minerality, added the heavy hitter. Also remarkable for such a young wine. He was quite eloquent for being so tipsy. And from the south near Toulouse, added one of his buddies, making it our wine, not theirs. Oh. A cool reference to the we saying northerners, those were fighting words. And that is exactly the opposite of ok is we, the language of the we speakers, are the northerners. I had to try it. Well then, I really could use a glass of Gaillac Primeur right now. Around for me and my friend, s'il vous plaît. We four then went and took a seat toward the back, safely away from the door. When the bartender arrived with our glasses, I could see the color was different too. Gaillac was deep garnet, where Beaujolais Nouveau was medium ruby. The Gaillac thus hinting at a pinch of quartz and iron earth and less tropical fruit. He set them on our table, and as I pulled out a bill to pay, he said, "This first round is on the gentleman who hit you." In any other context, those would be strange, dark words. But here they were bright and appropriate. We turned to the big-fisted man across the bar, who now had stepped away from the door, and worked his way around to the bar counter to a safer place for inebriated, burly men passionate for new wine. Raised our glasses and smiled. His eyes met ours. He raised his glass, and we drank. I savored the strong hit of young mineral. The throbbing in my nose subsided. This year tasted so earthy, it was grounding. So I think I'll stop there. And those are just a couple of vignettes from my forthcoming travel memoir, Café Oak. And in the meantime, before it comes out, I also have a blog called Café Oak that is little gems of the daily magic of this region. And that is where I will announce when the travel memoir comes out. Well, thank you so much. This is wonderful being here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Beebe.